Hello, listener. Welcome to Juniverse Cheating Stories. Please subscribe for more videos.
Amelia stood motionless by the frost-covered window, her eyes lost in the endless black of the night that seemed to stretch on forever. The wind howled outside, its icy breath creeping in through the cracks in the walls, but she felt nothing. She hadn't felt anything in weeks, not truly. Her heart was wrapped in an emptiness as vast and biting as the cold that swept across the countryside. What had once been her sanctuary, a small cottage filled with shared laughter, warmth, and love, now felt like a tomb. The walls, once full of life, seemed to echo with the hollow silence of a marriage that had withered. Ryan, her husband, was away again on one of his business trips. It was a familiar refrain, repeated so often that it no longer carried any weight. The truth was, he hadn't truly been home for a year, maybe more. Amelia could no longer remember the last time they had shared a conversation that wasn't about the latest deal or some trivial task. He was kind, successful, even charming. But all those qualities seemed distant now, like old memories fading away. His late nights, the endless phone calls, the cold detachment, had they always been like this? Or had she just been too blind to see it? The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second echoing through the stillness of the room. It was nearly midnight. But Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something was calling her. Something just beyond the edge of her awareness. Something that had been pulling her toward the barn for days now. Amelia stepped out into the biting night, the snow crunching beneath her boots with each slow, deliberate step. Her breath clouded in the air. A constant reminder of the cold that had settled deep within her. She hadn't intended to go out tonight, but the overwhelming weight of her thoughts had driven her to the edge. It had been weeks, maybe months, since she had felt anything that could be called connection. Not with Ryan, not with anyone. In his absence, her heart had begun to search for something. Anything to fill the gaping void inside her. Her steps carried her toward the barn, where Ace waited. The horse Ryan had given her 2 years ago. A gift that, in the beginning, had been a symbol of his affection, of their shared life. But now, it was the only thing that made her feel alive. Ace had become her lifeline. The one who had been there when she had felt utterly alone, when Ryan had been absent in both body and spirit. The barn door creaked open, and there he was, standing in the shadows, his dark eyes glowing softly in the dim light. Ace had always had a way of seeing her, truly seeing her, in a way no one else had. His presence was a quiet comfort. His steady gaze a balm for the raw wound of loneliness that had festered in her chest. For the first time in weeks, Amelia felt something stir deep within her. "You've been waiting for me, haven't you?" she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She wasn't sure why she said it, but it felt like a secret shared between them, a truth neither of them could deny. Of course, Ace didn't answer. Horses didn't speak, and yet, there was something in the way he stood, something in the way his gaze locked with hers, that felt like an answer in itself. She reached out to him, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against his soft, warm coat. The heat that radiated from him seemed to draw the chill from her bones, but it did more than that. It sent a jolt through her, a shock of sensation that shot straight to her heart. As her hand slid through his mane, a flood of emotion washed over her. The ache in her chest deepened, pressing against her ribs like a weight she couldn't escape. But there was something else, something that both terrified and excited her. The bond between them, unspoken but undeniable, stretched between them like a thin thread, pulling her closer, urging her forward into the unknown. Amelia had never planned for any of this. Never in her wildest dreams had she expected to find herself standing on the precipice of a choice that would tear her apart. She had never intended to cross a line, to risk losing herself in something she couldn't undo. But then, Jonathan entered their lives. Jonathan was Ace's trainer, a man who appeared as if he had stepped out of a storybook, enigmatic, elusive, and with a presence that commanded attention. He had come shortly after Ryan bought the horse, and from the very first moment Amelia laid eyes on him, something in the air shifted. There was an unspoken tension between them, a magnetic force that neither of them could deny. They exchanged few words, yet when he spoke, it was as if each sentence bore an intensity that seemed to cut through all the trivialities of her life. Jonathan's dark eyes held a kind of knowing, a depth that unsettled her in the most intoxicating way. He understood her in ways Ryan had long since stopped attempting. In his presence, Amelia felt both seen and vulnerable, as though he could peer into the very core of her and see the loneliness that had gnawed at her for so long. He never pushed, never demanded, but there was an undeniable connection between them, one she couldn't ignore. Once, after a long afternoon spent together at the barn, Jonathan had casually remarked, "Horses, like Ace, can sense things we refuse to acknowledge. Sometimes, it's loneliness that brings us together." At the time, Amelia had laughed it off as nothing more than a passing comment, a poetic observation from a man who spoke in riddles. But now, standing alone in the barn with Ace, his words took on a new meaning. The loneliness that had once been a quiet ache in her chest now screamed for attention. She wasn't just seeking comfort. She was desperate for someone, that could fill the empty spaces Ryan had left behind. And perhaps, just perhaps, that someone was Jonathan. 4. Crossing the line. The barn was eerily quiet as Amelia approached Ace, her hand trembling as it reached out to touch his glossy coat. She hadn't planned this, hadn't planned for the flood of emotions that surged through her as soon as her fingers brushed against his warmth. It was as though everything around her, every fear, every doubt, every yearning, had all led to this moment. The distance between them seemed to shrink on its own, as though some unseen force was urging her forward. Her breath became shallow, her pulse quickening as a strange heat spread through her body. The connection between them deepened, and Amelia's thoughts began to cloud. She had never felt like this before, never imagined she could lose herself in something so raw, so unrestrained. The line she had once held firmly in place, the line between yearning and action, was now gone, slipping further away with each breath she took. The ache in her chest, the hunger for something, anything, became a roaring need that she couldn't ignore. The world outside the barn ceased to exist. There was only her and Ace, and the quiet tension that pulled them together. Without thinking, Amelia leaned in closer, her lips brushing softly against the side of Ace's neck. The air around her seemed to hold its breath. And for a moment, she felt suspended in time, lost in the fragile beauty of the connection. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something darker. But just as she was about to surrender completely to the moment, the barn door creaked open. Amelia's heart stopped as she whipped around, the spell shattered in an instant. Standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light from outside, was Jonathan. His expression was unreadable. But his eyes, they were the same dark eyes that had seen her soul more clearly than anyone else ever had. And now, in this moment, his gaze was fixed on her with a mixture of surprise, understanding, and something deeper, something far more dangerous. "You didn't think this would stay hidden, did you?" Jonathan's voice was calm, almost too calm, but the words hit her like a slap to the face. She didn't need to hear more. His gaze told her everything. Amelia felt herself unraveling, every hidden desire and long-repressed thought suddenly exposed. She could feel the weight of his stare on her skin, and for the first time in years, she understood what it was to be truly seen. The air in the barn was thick with tension. Every breath Amelia took feeling heavier than the last. Her back pressed against Ace's side, his warmth offering some comfort, but it was fleeting, like a thin veil over a storm she couldn't escape. Jonathan's gaze was unwavering, piercing through her like an unseen force, amplifying the weight of her actions with each passing moment. She felt the suffocating guilt and fear crawl under her skin, settling deep within her bones. But there was something else, something far more unsettling. A strange sense of relief began to seep in, though she couldn't understand it. It was as if the secret, the betrayal she had been carrying in silence, was no longer hers to bear alone. In that instant when Jonathan had caught her, when the truth had been exposed, Amelia realized that the weight of her choices had already shifted. It was no longer about hiding, no longer about running. She looked up at Jonathan, his eyes filled with a mixture of knowing and something darker. "You're right," she whispered, her voice breaking, barely a murmur. "There's no running from this." Jonathan stepped forward, his boots crunching softly in the hay, his presence commanding, yet filled with a strange understanding. "Amelia, you've been hiding for so long. You can't keep pretending this doesn't matter." His words hit her like a blow. She wanted to respond, wanted to scream that she was sorry, that she hadn't meant for it to go this far. But the words caught in her throat, tangled up in the mess of guilt and confusion swirling inside her. All she could do was stand there, frozen, her heart racing with a truth she could no longer deny. Jonathan's voice softened. "This isn't just about what's been done. It's about what happens now." She closed her eyes, trying to swallow the lump in her throat. She had crossed a line, a point of no return, and the full weight of that reality crashed down on her. There was no turning back. Not anymore. Just as the silence between them deepened, a distant sound cut through the stillness, a car engine, low but growing louder, slicing through the quiet like a knife. Amelia's heart lurched in her chest, panic rising as the headlights cut through the barn door. Ryan. He was home early. Her breath caught, lodged in her throat like a heavy stone. She hadn't expected him for hours, and now, in this moment, everything was about to be laid bare. Amelia. Jonathan's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts, as if sensing her growing dread. You need to face this. The door to the barn creaked open, and Amelia stood there, rooted to the floor, as Ryan's figure appeared in the doorway. Her stomach twisted, and she could feel her pulse throbbing in her temples. The truth was no longer just hers. It was about to be exposed. Everything she had tried to bury, all the lies she had whispered to herself, were about to come crashing into the light. She glanced at Jonathan, his eyes locked onto hers, the weight of his gaze heavy with expectation. Amelia knew that this was it, the moment she had feared. The moment she had been dreading for so long. Ryan stepped out of the car, his movements slow and deliberate, his face a mask of unreadable calm. He had always been the steady one. The one who could mask every emotion behind the smooth veneer of control. But tonight, Amelia could sense that something had shifted. There was an edge to his presence. A quiet tension in the air between them that spoke louder than any words could. Her heart hammered in her chest as she watched him walk toward the barn. She didn't need to hear his footsteps to know that he knew. He knew something was wrong. The silence between them was heavy, a thick blanket that threatened to suffocate her. Amelia? Ryan's voice sliced through the stillness, and her name on his lips felt like a verdict. His eyes swept over the barn, searching the shadows, piecing together the pieces of the puzzle that had been missing for so long. Jonathan stepped aside, silently giving space for Ryan to enter. Amelia stood in the center of the barn, exposed and trembling, her heart racing as she met her husband's gaze. She wanted to lie, to tell him that everything was fine, that nothing had happened, but the weight of the truth crushed her words before they could even leave her lips. Nothing's going on, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But even she knew it wasn't true. Her words were hollow, desperate, and the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Ryan's eyes narrowed, his gaze locking onto hers. Searching for the truth she could no longer hide. You can lie to yourself all you want, Amelia. Jonathan's voice cut through the tension, his words sharp as a blade. But you can't lie to him. Amelia stood there, caught in the eye of the storm, as the full weight of her choices crashed down around her. The path ahead was uncertain. Every road seemed to lead to a dead end. She didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear: her life would never be the same again. The question that loomed before her was not just about what would happen with Ryan. It was about her, about whether she could face the consequences of her actions, or whether she would continue to live in the shadows, drowning in self-deception. The silence between them grew, thick with unspoken words, and Amelia knew the moment had arrived. Would she face the truth, or would she continue to hide behind the mask she had so carefully crafted? Thank you for listening. If you were Amelia, what would you do in this situation? At what point did you realize the true depth of the betrayal? Would you confront the truth, or keep running from it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories like this.